Hello and welcome to Team 8's presentation on the ethics of Apple's iPhone slowdown. In December of 2017, an article on Geekbench.com proved that Apple was indeed slowing down the processing power on its older iPhone models. This deliberate slowdown of phone performance, also known as throttling, supported consumer theories alleging Apple practiced a planned obsolescence of its older phones. These theories claimed Apple purposefully slowed their performance of their older iPhone models so frustrated consumers would be compelled to buy a new iPhone sooner than they would otherwise. The Geekbench.com article quickly went viral, and within a matter of days, almost all major news outlets had confirmed the findings, forcing Apple to reply. Shortly thereafter, Apple confirmed that they had in fact been slowing down processing speeds on older iPhone models with newer releases of its iOS platform. However, Apple claimed this was actually to benefit the consumer, as older phone models were susceptible to battery degradation and peak phone usage could cause unexpected battery shutdowns. As such, by slowing the performance of older devices with older batteries, Apple claimed they were in fact protecting consumers' phones from crashing. Consumers didn't buy it. Did their trusted Apple really have their best interests at heart, or was this a ploy just to sell them more? How could this be going on for over a year and Apple not tell them? After all, would Apple have ever told them at all if consumers didn't prove the theories right themselves? That leads us to wonder, did Apple have an ethical obligation to be forthcoming with their throttling practices? There are several perspectives to consider in determining what was Apple's ethical obligation in the case of this nature. We'll argue that as a business, Apple indeed had an ethical obligation to be forthcoming regarding the throttling. To start, we can analyze what groups stood to benefit from Apple's decisions to slow down older iPhone models. First and foremost, Apple benefited as consumers using older phone models were compelled to upgrade to newer phone models sooner than they would normally. The performance throttling was perceived by users as the need to purchase a newer, better performing model. This in turn generated increased phone sales and larger profits, creating a benefit for both Apple and thus Apple shareholders. Furthermore, Apple phone manufacturers, part suppliers, and phone carriers selling Apple products would also benefit as the increased demand would lead to increased new phone orders. Apple and its supply chain reaps the largest benefits as their throttling practice directly leads to increased sales. Alternatively, Apple phone users that do not care about phone performance speed may actually benefit if the throttling does increase phone longevity as Apple claims. Next, we'll look at what groups were harmed by Apple's decision to throttle phone performance without informing consumers. Most prominently, Apple consumers with older phones were harmed by the performance slowdown. As speed has become ubiquitous with the rise of technology, small changes in performance have large impact on the psychology of users. The consumers were using phones performing at noticeably slower speeds, taking longer to load their apps, and suffering from frustratingly slow speeds. These consumers were unknowingly being persuaded to upgrade their phones in order to restore the performance speeds they had previously become accustomed to. Furthermore, other phone manufacturers were harmed by Apple not being forthcoming with consumers. Fully informed consumers may have chosen an Android or other device over an iPhone. Thus, other phone makers were not necessarily in fair competition with Apple, as customers were not making fully informed decisions. Lastly, Apple shareholders were harmed by the performance slowdown. Shareholders were exposed to more risk than they were possibly comfortable with and were left in a position susceptible to consumer backlash when the policy was exposed.
As for whose rights will be exercised, the rights of Apple executives were exercised because they were able to slow down their old iPhones so that customers were forced to upgrade to a newer phone model. Also, the rights of investors were exercised. Even though they might not have known about the slowing down of the old iPhones, they were still able to benefit from the extra revenues that were generated from customer upgrades. Similarly, the rights of Congress policymakers were exercised since they were able to question Apple's decision to slow down iPhones and force Apple to compensate the customers who were harmed by this conundrum. Additionally, customers who were competent in technology were able to notice the difference between the old models and newer models. They were able to share their opinions and frustration on social media and other media outlets. Mainstream media outlets were able to get involved and hold Apple and its executives accountable.
Whose rights will be ignored? The rights of all iPhone users were ignored when Apple began to throttle the processing speeds of iPhones. Even those that had the newest models soon after its release would still be susceptible to having their rights ignored in less than a year, when the new models would then be released. When the consumers were unaware of the manipulation that was occurring behind their iPhones, they weren't provided with the information required to make an informed decision. Instead, they were persuaded into purchasing new iPhones earlier than they would have typically due to the frustration created by throttling performance. This is an especially important point when considering those that would use an iPhone for 2, 3, 4, or even 5 or more years, or those that might not have the luxury of buying new phones every year. Apple essentially withheld rights to those without as much money or means to upgrade their phones every year. The moral problem and concerns. Is it right that Apple throttled processing speeds of older phones without consumers' knowledge or approval? Is it right that Apple slowed consumers' processing speeds without informing shareholders what they were doing? Is it right that consumers were left in the dark as to how Apple was manipulating them into becoming frustrated with slow processing speeds and in turn upgrade their phones earlier than they would have otherwise? Is it right that Apple couldn't at least give consumers the choice of if opting into this throttling functionality? Is it right that Apple couldn't modify their operating system to save battery life without informing their customers?
Next, we're going to talk about the economic benefits. Obviously, the majority of the economic benefit of throttling processing speeds of older phones was captured by Apple, their shareholders, as well as their stakeholders and their overall supply chain. The throttling, it really pushed customers to always be buying the newest phones and drove iPhone sales, where Apple makes a huge profit in comparison to their competitors. And due to this dishonesty, I think in the next few years, we'll see that competitors will potentially increase their sales due to customers looking for a more consistent product or a company that consumers feel is more open and honest. And so we can look for that here in the future. The third point is secondhand buyers may also benefit from these older phones being on the market. I myself, I'm not willing to pay the premium to have the newest phone. However, because of this practice, I did see a lot of secondhand phones being sold into the market, and individuals like myself were able to benefit off of that. Next, we're going to talk about the legal requirements and the legal issues that Apple ran into. Anthony Dimesies, he's the National Program Director of the International Law Group at the University of Ottawa. He highlighted that the issue wasn't that they were slowing phones down, it was that they didn't tell customers, whether they wanted to tell customers saying that it was to save their battery life and make the phone last longer. The issue is that they didn't tell customers, and that's one requirement that they held. And he feels that when individuals buy a phone, they're really getting into a contract with Apple. Next, when we're talking about Apple throttling processing speeds of older phones, this also brings up the issue that could flow into next generation technology, such as autonomous vehicles. Anthony, he specifically talking about this, he said, I quote, "From my perspective, this will become, and it should already be, a legislature matter, and we should have legislation to prevent this." Since he mentioned that, we've seen hearings in Congress, we've seen hearings in the Senate, we've seen the Department of Justice investigate this matter further, as well as many, many different class action lawsuits that are currently in the courts and some that have already gone through many of the courts. More globally, we saw that Italy, they fined Apple 10 million euros. France has now made it illegal to intentionally shorten the lifespan of any product. So, looking at this from an overall perspective, we do see that there were legal issues and legal requirements. And that was just the tip, but we also see this will lead into potentially ethical duties that Apple should have also been aware of, and they should have really helped out their customers instead of hurting them.
When examining the eternal law or the moral law of nature viewpoint of the iOS slowdown issue, Apple was within their own rights to conduct business as a large enterprise corporation in a capitalistic market. An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law. However, we believe that Apple was violating eternal law by not performing the most ethical and honest duty to their fellow men. This also damaged their personal virtue as they were not performing to the highest moral excellence that is valued as a foundation of principle and good moral being to their consumers. If Apple informed their customers that their devices would slow down over time at the point of sale, this would have been deemed more ethical than what actually happened. The fact that Apple tried to hide in the shadows and slow down devices without being upfront with their actions makes us question their utilitarian beliefs toward their customers that allow Apple to thrive. The slowing down of these devices brought frustration and unhappiness to many of their customers, which detracts from the utilitarian belief to promote the greatest happiness towards your fellow men. The universal duties and contributive liberty of a large corporation is to create jobs, provide benefits such as healthcare, dental insurance, and ensure that their employees and customers are contributing to society via their platform. We believe that Apple did provide those benefits to their employees, but failed their customers by intentionally slowing down their products without honesty at the point of sale. This could be easily turned around as long as honesty is presented to the customer and there is no hidden agenda behind the scenes. However, the distributive justice of goods does provide fairness to the customers, as there is no one product being sold to one specific customer that is superior than another. In the end, the long-term interest of Apple is to gain as much profit as possible, and having their customers purchase new products sooner than necessary by slowing down their devices would do just that. However, since the leak of this accusation by greenbench.com in 2017 did indeed provide evidence of the slowing down of devices, the long-term interests of the customers may diminish as brand loyalty might decline due to the ethical duties of Apple Inc. In conclusion, Apple confirmed the company had in fact been slowing processing speeds on older iPhone models as newer updates were released of iOS. Apple then pivoted after these reports were confirmed and claimed this was actually to benefit the customer, as they were protecting their devices from crashing. However, would Apple actually have ever publicly acknowledged this practice if consumers didn't find it? Would they have admitted to the slowing down of products before they were caught? Apple has a moral and ethical obligation to be forthright with its customers, shareholders, stakeholders, and fair competition around them. Consumers also have the moral right to be fully informed to make their own decisions, which may or may not impact the longevity of the company in the long run. Apple had an ethical obligation to inform all customers before implementing this policy, and now the customers have the option to decide whether or not they would like to oblige to the moral and ethical dilemma implemented by the actions of Apple as a company.